So this storm began to arrive on Sunday, August 27th. Excuse me, August 28th. It begins to arrive, and people at first notice it as, these sort of high winds beginning to shift around. Um, but people are still more or less going about their day. I've read many accounts of how folks just went to church as usual that Sunday, despite sort of the clouds and the growing rainstorms as the bands of the hurricane begin to approach the coast.
Mm.
Um, but it's really not until the early evening when people up and down the coast begin to realize that this is going to be an extremely powerful and dangerous storm. And there are a couple things that made this storm particularly powerful. One was that it arrived on the coast in Charleston, for example, when high tide hit. And what not only did it hit during high tide, it had also sort of with the strength of the storm, sort of dragged this huge storm surge behind it as well. So that you have this high tide and you have the storm surge. It's
Right.
also not just any high tide, it's also high tide during a full moon, which means that it was, of course, an even higher tide than usual.
Mm.
This is partially what makes this storm so dangerous, is this massive storm surge. And this storm surge inundated a large number of the sea islands, under many feet of water in some cases. Kiowa Island, for example, which is just south of Charleston, it's about 10 miles long and about a mile or two wide, was completely covered in water. A number of other of the sea islands were as well. So this is what makes the storm so dangerous and so deadly, is this storm surge. The other thing that makes this storm so deadly is the fact that its height is in the dead of night. So not only do you have this huge storm surge, but it also strikes in the middle of the night. The hurricane itself makes landfall somewhere between midnight and sort of 1:30 a.m. So not only do you have, in some cases, places covered in 20 feet of water, but this is also happening in the depth of the evening. And that makes escaping and trying to find safe harbor very difficult. There are countless stories. That's the one thing about this hurricane. It actually has quite a lot of documentation of it. And one of the things that you see that's sort of a recurrent theme is people trying to survive despite the fact that it's pitch black out, that they're fighting against floodwaters, and that they're dealing with winds of up to 120 miles per hour.
Mm.
So it's this horrific to imagine and to think about, what this would have meant and what this would have looked like. And indeed, most of the stories that you can read about this hurricane involve people watching family members die or desperately attempting survival themselves. Stories of, for example, um, one that was recounted by a white woman in Beaufort, South Carolina, recalled she lived in sort of a wealthy part of Beaufort in a house that her father owned. And she recalled a middle aged African American man sort of desperately knocking on their front door at, about, I think, 11 p.m. on August 28th. And you have to think about how desperate he must have been, because, first of all, knocking on the front door of a house belonging to white people would have been sort of verboten at any other time.
Mm.
But he had with him a boat full of family members, community members, and loved ones that he had saved from the floodwaters, and they
Mm.
needed a place to stay. And this house, because it was, built for this white family, was sturdy and above the storm surge and going through the storm quite well. And he asked if they could stay on the porch for the night, as he wanted to go back out in his boat to try to rescue more people, to bring them to sort of this safe haven. And the father of this young white woman actually let them into the house. And the young man went back out into the storm to rescue more people that night as well. But when they left the next morning, as the water had receded, they had to step over the bodies of an older African American couple who he had not been able to save.
Right.
Um, so the archive is filled with these kinds of accounts. Many of them, of course, filtered through the perspective of white South Carolinians. So you have to sort of peel back these pieces. But this just gives you sort of a sense of what this was, right? To survive was only really possible if you knew your surroundings very well, if you knew where high ground was, if you were able to get there in time, if you had someone to help take you in, if there was someone who might come rescue you, if you had some sort of knowledge of how to get through this. And
Mhm.
even then, of course, that was not always enough.
Mhm.
So yes, that's just one sort of small glimpse into what that night was like,
Mhm.
and what made this particular storm so incredibly deadly. Um,